All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the first WISM of this 2024 semester. Today, we're excited to kick off the new semester with, or I guess at this point it's midway, but first talk of the WISM series with Ines Levin, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Irvine, talking about um, the vote among 16 and 17-year-olds actually using LAPOP data. So sort of a self-serving purpose inviting her to this LAPOP series, but I'm sure it'll be really useful for everybody. So Inez, do you want to take it away?
Thank you. I'm very excited to be presenting this paper. First, it's the first time that I'm presenting it, so I have barely talked about this project to anybody so far. I haven't had the chance. It's also the first time that I study this question about the political maturity of very young voters. And also I'm especially excited about presenting this paper here because I would really like feedback on the data that I'm using, right? Because I'm sure that there will be people in this audience who are more familiar with these data sets at least than I am. So I'm very curious about what you have to say about the findings and how I work with the data. Okay, so the paper is titled Are 16-year-olds mature enough to vote? I use here data from four Latin American countries that allow voting at 16. So this lowering the voting age to 16 has marked like a significant policy shift in many countries. So in Latin America, there are four countries right now that allow voting at 16, including Nicaragua, that allows voting at 16 since 1984, Brazil, that allows voting at 16 since 1988, Ecuador since 2008, and Argentina since 2012. Okay. Um, Interestingly, there is pretty much no research on voting at 16 in Latin America. I found one book chapter that looks at focuses more on kind of political trust and kind of it's not a very in-depth analysis using data from Latino Barometro, but where they don't really use data from uh, comprehensive data from uh, young voters in these countries. Like there are some issues with that analysis in that chapter. But other than that, I didn't find anything else. And I find this interesting because if you look up on Google search voting at 16, there is plenty of research on the topic, but pretty much all of it, almost all of it, focuses on the experience of a few European countries. Um, where interestingly, until recently, there was only one European country that allowed voting at 16. So Austria has allowed voting at 16 since 2007. So many of the existing research focuses on the Austrian case. Um, and some of the other research done in Europe focuses on the experience of, for example, of a few regions in selected European countries, say local elections or pilot trials where voting at 16 was used in the context of like a very specific election, right? Um, so, so again, there are not that many places in Europe that until now have allowed voting at 16. Uh, Definitely not at all compared to Latin America, where we have countries that have allowed voting at 16 for many years. But however, most of the research focuses in Europe. I just find it interesting, right? And I think that one of the main reasons why this is the case, my guess is that because we just don't have data, like or enough data from Latin America about the experiences of voters who are either 16 and 17 in these four countries that allow voting at 16. Okay, so I think it probably has to do with lack of data. That would be my guess about why people haven't looked at the Latin American case. So here I focus on the Latin American case, and I think that it's interesting not just because some of these countries in Latin America have a long experience with voting at 16, but also because this is a region that faces unique socio-political challenges, right? So some of these countries have a history of political instability that say you don't normally see in Western European countries, with say varying trust in democratic institutions. So questions open up regarding voting at 16 that don't necessarily that are not necessarily considered in the context of European elections. So, for example, there might be concerns about when people discuss like the pros and cons of allowing voting at 16, there might be concerns about whether there is enough support for democracy among the young, right? And what could be the consequences for political stability, right, of allowing very young people to vote? I mean, those are questions that I can imagine people being more concerned about in the Latin American case than in the European case. Like, although I may be wrong, but right? I mean, it's like new questions. Given that this is a different region facing different challenges, it also raises different or new questions, right? Okay, so yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure. Do you want to share your slides or?
I'm sorry. I thought I was sharing my slides.
No, that's okay.
I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
I didn't
This
know if
has
you were
happened to
just
me
providing
before.
an introduction or.
Because I was looking at the slides and going through them, assuming that that you are seeing the slides, and this has happened to me before in previous Zoom presentations. I'm
No worries.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but thank you
I
for
can.
letting me know.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me go back because I skipped a few slides. Okay.
Yeah. I think we all followed what you were saying. But
Okay, so title slide.
yeah.
So here there's some information on the countries that allow voting at 16. So I will say that, so regarding Europe, now that we came back to the initial slide, an interesting thing is that my sense is that this policy shift is an ongoing change. Okay, so we already have some countries that in recent years have adopted voting at 16. And my guess is that we're going to keep seeing this debate emerge in or persist in many countries, and that more and more countries are going to slowly move toward younger voting ages. And I think that's why this is such an important question to investigate, right? Because it's not just about understanding what is going on in the countries that right now allow voting at 16, but this is really something that more research on this area will really inform the debate going forward. Okay. So, for example, just to give you an example, if you look here at the last bullet, in this year, Germany and Belgium moved toward allowing voters who are people who are 16 and 17 to vote in European elections. Okay, and there's an ongoing debate in these countries, and chances are that these countries in the future will allow voting at 16 in national elections as well. This is what we've seen before in other countries. So, for example, Scotland first allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in the independence referendum, and then it moved toward allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to just vote in national elections. So sometimes the change happens progressively. So in Germany, we've been seeing 16 and 17-year-olds voting in local elections in some regions for a while already, and some of the research that exists on this topic focuses on German regions, right? So in many of these countries, we see sort of experimenting with this in kind of at the local level, in trials, in EU elections, and then eventually the countries move toward just adopting voting at 16 nationally, right? So this is the way in which I'm seeing this happening, at least in Europe. And so let's turn now toward, so I don't want to spend a long time talking about like the whole debate about voting at 16. I want to focus on the parts of that debate that really speaks to what I investigate in this paper, okay? So in terms of arguments in favor, okay, some of the arguments in favor are that that allowing young individuals to vote sort of fosters their political engagement, so that when they become older, they already have a habit of turning out to vote and are more engaged citizens. And also that allowing young voters to vote ensures that their interests are taken into account when it comes to important to policy areas where there's a lot at stake, and including for very young voters. So, for example, policies related to climate change, right? But when it comes to the critics of these reforms, one of the main concerns is that young people might not be mature enough to vote. Okay, and there's this concern that they might also be very vulnerable to influence by others. Okay, so that's what I focus. The specific question that I focused in this paper is whether 16 and 17-year-olds are mature enough to vote. Now, I had to spend some time thinking about like how to approach this question. So one issue that I faced early on is that it's really hard to come up with like an absolute answer to this question, right? To just say, are they, in the sense of saying they either say, for example, being able to identify a threshold level of maturity above which people are mature enough to vote. Okay, that is any decision concerning where that threshold lies is highly subjective. Okay, not just that, but when you look at the laws, right, that exist across countries regarding voting eligibility, political maturity is not a requirement, right? So then why should we as researchers make draws like strong conclusions about people sufficiently or insufficiently mature to vote when law actually doesn't require that people be mature above a certain level, right? So I try to kind of avoid that direction, right, when it came to approaching this question. So rather, what I try to do is to look at this question from a relative point of view. So the idea is that right now there is like a widespread agreement that 18, 17, 19, 18, people who are 18 and 19 years old should be allowed to vote. There is no controversy when it comes to that. Okay, society has accepted that 18 and 19-year-olds are mature enough to vote. Okay, so that's no longer something that is. I mean, there are, say for example, there are concerns about sometimes people who are very young not being sufficiently politically engaged and not participating in elections in large numbers. But what I mean is like we no longer see discussions of whether they should be allowed to vote. Okay, people who are 18 and 19. Okay, so then what I try to do is to say, well, if when you look at 16 and 17-year-olds, they cannot be distinguished from 18 and 19-year-olds when it comes to political maturity, then why do we say or should we be concerned about their level of political maturity? See what I mean? So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking. Okay, so if you cannot distinguish the level of political maturity of 16, 17-year-olds from the maturity of older voters, then this concern in particular doesn't seem warranted. Okay, so and I'm not saying that other concerns that I'm not detailing here are not important. So, for example, some concerns that again are not the focus of this paper have to do with the stakes in political decision making, right? And so, for example, a lot of people who are 16, 17 don't yet work, right? While most of those who are 18 and 19 and older, right? No, not most, but a much larger fraction do work, right? And the same happens with paying taxes, with being treated as adults for the purpose of the justice system, right? I mean, there are arguments that say that in many areas of life, 16, 17-year-olds are not treated as adults, and because of that, then maybe they should wait to be eligible to vote. So I mean, but that's kind of a different part of the debate, and that's not what I'm focusing on here. Okay, so I focus on the narrower question, simply of political maturity and nothing else. Okay, and so but that's just so the first decision that I had to make had to do with how am I going to approach this question? So I'm going to look at absolute levels of political maturity or at relative levels of political maturity. And I chose to go in the direction of like relative levels, okay? Just comparing 16, 17 with older voters and trying to see if they differ significantly in terms of maturity. But then, of course, there's this other big question, which is like, okay, well, then how do we measure maturity, right? So the first thing so when it came to this other challenge, the first thing that I had to do is to identify how this concept is defined. And I tried here not to reinvent the wheel. So I just went over the literature on this topic, and I looked at how this notion was defined in the past. And I thought that as far as the definition goes, there is quite a lot of consistency. Okay, so here there's a quote in this slide from Chan and Clayton from 2006 that defines political maturity as one's ability and willingness to consider the effects of decisions on society at large, as well as oneself. Okay, so they focus on the ability and willingness to cast an informed vote, okay, or kind of a high quality vote. Of course, here then there are questions about, well, what is how do you measure ability? How do you measure willingness, right? So I noticed that there is quite a lot of consistency in the definition, but there is inconsistency in the measurement, okay? So the indicators of political, so the approach that was used in the past is to try to not come up with a single, for example, survey question used to assess political maturity, but rather to collect data on a number of indicators that put together give a sense of the respondents' level of political maturity. Okay, but so for example, many previous studies have looked at political interest, political knowledge, political efficacy, both internal and external, attitudinal consistency. For example, attitudinal consistency is used to evaluate whether whether voters are able to make rational decisions. So there are some papers that look at, for example, ideological consistency, right? When asked questions about positions on different policy issues, whether respondents provide answers that are consistent across issues, right? And papers differ in terms of how they measure consistency. So there are other papers that also look at for example, partisanship and strength of partisanship. And so if you look at the papers that look at political maturity, what you will notice is that there are some indicators that are almost always considered like political interest and some measures of political knowledge, of factual political knowledge, but there is some inconsistency in the other indicators that are used. Okay, even when it comes to political knowledge, the type of factual questions that are used to evaluate it vary across papers. Okay, again, when you talk about when you look at attitudinal consistency, how it is measured and consistency across what also varies a lot across papers. So again, there is the previous literature is a little bit heterogeneous in terms of the information that is used to assess political maturity. Okay, and again, so my guess is that because they, as well as me here, okay, are doing this in a way after the data has already been collected, right? And so we have not designed these questionnaires, right, that we use. And so we look in these data sets for those indicators that we can find that we can argue relate more closely to the definition of political maturity. But what is available varies a lot across the different survey data sets that different studies have used, right? So in this paper, now later I will talk about the different indicators in more detail, but something that I do that is slightly different from the European research is that I also take into account support for democratic values, okay? And so that's something that we don't typically see in the papers that look at political maturity in Europe. And when I look at attitudinal consistency, since there were no questions on positions on policy issues that I could use to evaluate ideological consistency, I looked at attitudinal consistency by looking at questions on support for democracy. Okay, so I will explain that soon. Okay, so by the way, if anybody has any questions as I'm talking, please let me raise your hand, interrupt me. That's totally okay. So another difference between my study and what was done before, okay? So far I would say, I should have here a kind of a table that kind of helps people situate what I do compared to what others did before. I would say that the first decision that I had to make about like looking at political maturity in relative terms, that is kind of consistent with what others have done before, like this comparison of very young voters with slightly older voters to see if they are significantly less mature. Okay, then I make some different decisions regarding what indicators to consider, and of course I look at a different region. But then another big difference is that all previous studies, um, when they do the data analysis, they look at each dimension separately. Okay, so it's like they first look at political interest, they then look at political knowledge, then at political efficacy, then at say attitudinal consistency. Each one is analyzed separately. So a problem with a lot of these papers is that they don't have like a so say when they draw a conclusion, they don't have a conclusion that applies to the concept of political maturity in general. Okay, and sometimes they find no differences along one dimension, but slight differences along another dimension. So it's hard from an analysis like that, right, where each dimension is considered separately, to draw like overall conclusions. So what I do here is like early on in the paper, just as a way of kind of examining the data, I do look at each indicator separately. I don't spend a lot of time in the paper discussing what happens with each indicator separately because I don't have space. But I do provide information in the paper about differences between 16, 17 and older voters that I see along specific indicators. Okay, some of those results are all in the appendix. Like I don't spend time discussing them in the paper. But what I find reassuring is that what I find concerning overall maturity is consistent with what I find when I look at each indicator separately. Like if you go over the appendix, you will see that. It's not as if, say, you're going to see what my conclusion is, and I will conclude the same had I not done what I'm going to describe now. Okay. Okay, so what did I do? So in the paper, instead of looking at each indicator separately, okay, I estimated a latent variable model, okay, where I make the assumption that there is that each individual has like a latent level of political maturity that influences, right, the values that you observe along the different indicators, right? So, for example, people who are more politically mature have more political interest, more political knowledge, report higher levels of political efficacy, stronger support for democratic values, and greater levels of attitudinal consistency. So I don't assume that that is a relationship between the latent variable and the indicators, but that is what I expect to find. And actually, it is what I find. Now, when I show you the estimated loadings from the Bayesian factor analytical model, you're going to see that the latent variable relates to the observed indicators in the way that I expect. Okay, so it loads on the different dimensions as one would expect. So I estimate this factor analytical model using Bayesian methods, okay, using MCMC methods. So this approach has one nice advantage that it has is that, so for example, for every respondent in the sample, I'm able to come up with a measure of political maturity, but I don't learn only about like the average level of political maturity for each individual, but about the distribution of political maturity. And I will say, like so far, I have focused mostly on the average estimates, but the output of this estimation is much richer. Okay, it can goes beyond what I actually have even analyzed so far, right? Because for every estimate from this model, we learn about the entire distribution. Okay. So this is information that we wouldn't get at all if, for example, we used traditional factor analysis, right, to estimate this model. Although I will say I also did traditional factor analysis, and results are consistent with what I found. Right? So it seems as if results are very robust to the technique in the case of this data. Okay. Okay, so let me talk a little bit before I show you the results. It's already 9:25. Okay, I know I don't have much time, but let me tell you a little bit about the data. So I use data from the 2021 and 2023 waves of the Americas Barometer surveys. So this gives me data from several countries, right? From Nicaragua, Brazil, Ecuador, and Argentina. And if I say anything that is wrong, please interrupt me and tell me, because I'm probably not aware of what whatever you know about this data that I don't. Okay, so um, so let me tell you about why did I start working on this paper? I've always been curious about this question of like the maturity of people who are 16 and 17 years old, but I just had never come across data from interviews to 16, 17 years old. And one day I was looking at the LAPOP data, right? Just like going over the data sets and getting a sense of what they had. And I noticed that there were interviews to people who were 16 and 17. And I thought that it was amazing. Like, and I was surprised that I had never seen people use this data. Of course, the 2023 data has been recently released, right? Um, but I did look at data from earlier waves, and I from earlier than 2021. And in those earlier waves, I didn't see for any of these four countries interviews to people who are 16 and 17. So my assumption, and again, it might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, tell me, is that America's barometers began interviewing people who are 16 and 17 in these four countries in the 2021 wave. Like I didn't see in the earlier waves interviews to people who are 16 and 17. So again, if you think I made a mistake and actually there is data for earlier than that, I mean, if one of you knows, I would appreciate it, like the information. I did check earlier data sets and I didn't find for earlier data sets like interviews to 16, 17. Okay, let me see, there's something in the chat. Oh, okay, so there's a comment that says that interviews to 16, 17 started earlier in 2014. That's interesting, and I should definitely check it. That would be amazing because then my data set would grow in size a lot. But the main limitation of this paper right now is the sample size, right? I mean, I don't talk about that in detail in the paper, but of course, like it's obvious that the main limitation of the analysis. So if I was able to add data from earlier waves that also interviewed 16, 17, that would be really good. But I didn't see in the earlier data sets interviews to 16, 17 years old. But I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but I would definitely will check. So again, so if somebody knows more about this, like I would appreciate the information. But I will check. I don't know why I didn't see it for the other waves. So for example, in Brazil, this there is this data collection effort that has been taking place for like a very, very, very long time. And they've always consistently been interviewing people who are 16 and 17. And actually, I'm planning a different project that will involve looking at this data from Brazil. What I think is special about America's barometer is that we are able to compare different countries, and countries are very different, like in terms of political institutions, like democratic instability and so on, right? Like I like this idea of like comparing different countries, and we can only do it with data sets like this one, right? Where we have similar survey instruments applied to different countries. For the 2021-2023 waves, in total, putting together the four countries, okay, there were slightly less than 700 respondents who were 16, 17-year-old, okay? And there were about 1,200 respondents who were 18, 19, okay? So it's a small sample size. In my analysis, I do control for country, okay, for country of origin. So as I said here, I'm not aware of interviews to 16-year-olds in earlier America's barometer surveys. But I will need to recheck definitely just to make sure. Also, another thing I was curious, but is that if the 16, 17-year-olds started being interviewed in 2021, like I don't know what prompted that change, right? In like this extension of interviews to younger people. But if they've always been interviewed in these four countries since 2014, then maybe this question is not relevant. Okay. So does somebody else know for sure, like if these data sets for earlier waves have data for people who are
Yeah,
16,
we
17?
we definitely do. Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
we definitely do have should have that information in earlier waves. I can double check for you,
Okay.
but as far as I know, and I process most of these, so they should be there. If
Okay.
not,
Okay.
then I need to take a look at it. But you know,
Okay.
these it should exist.
Okay, I will check, because it's kind of one thing. One reason why this is like a sensitive in a way is because if here in the US we want to do surveys with winter use 16, 17, we need to get special IRB approval, right? So I was wondering, like, when that decision was made by the lab, because they probably needed a special permission, right?
Yeah,
To use.
Liz can speak to the IRB permissions with regard to that, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, quickly on that. So
I know
we
this. I'm
define-
presenting, and I shouldn't be the one asking the question.
No, please. We wanted you to join us for the series so we could have a conversation about your work. So we define adults by, what is an adult, what is a child? The IRB does not have any preset definition for that. You sort of work with, you can pick a definition, right? So the definition that political scientists tend to use is voting age, right? So someone who is voting age is considered an adult. So in the studies where we interview people who are 16 or 17, they're considered adults in that country by that definition. So the IRB does not consider them children.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so there was across 2021, 2023, and also across countries, there were sometimes differences, right, as you are all well aware, in the survey instruments. So sometimes there are questions that are asked in one year but not the other, questions that are asked in one country but not another. So when it comes to these indicators that I use to measure political maturity, I do have instances of either years or countries or combinations of country years where responses were missing for one of these variables, right? Where I have item no response. So there's a table in the appendix where I include detailed information about the wording of every question that I use. And there is a column saying availability where I say for what country and year that question was available, okay? So all information on missing data is documented in the appendix. And what I did is I used multiple imputation to learn or to impute the missing values in those country years where the data was missing, okay? So I will say that the data that I used to do the multiple imputation includes more columns than the ones I used in the analysis, okay? Data about more demographics and more political attitudes than I used in the analysis. Why? Because I wanted to have columns that could be used as predictors for the multiple imputation procedure, okay? And there's a footnote in the paper that explains what was included in the multiple imputation procedure, okay? So that's how I handle the missing data. I prefer to do that rather than drop all the indicators that were not available in a certain country year, because I would have ended up with very little information to measure to evaluate political maturity. Okay. As I said, so here's a list of the different indicators. So political interest and knowledge, those are true measures. Political efficacy, internal and external, true additional measures. Support for democracy and system support, true measures, again, of democratic values. And attitudinal consistency. When it comes to attitudinal consistency, you're going to see, if you look at the previous literature, that different authors proceed in a different way. Sometimes they look, for example, at, say, they come up with evaluation of attitudinal consistency at the aggregate level. Here, since I wanted to come up with I didn't want to just evaluate if, for example, 16, 17-year-olds are as consistent as older voters. I didn't just want to do that. I wanted to get a measure of attitudinal consistency that then I could use as an indicator for the latent variable model, right? So I needed individual level estimates of attitudinal consistency. So what I did is I estimated a linear regression model where I tried to explain support for democracy along a 7-point scale in terms of responses to several other questions that evaluate in different ways democratic values, okay? So then I took that model of support for democracy and I used it to predict support for democracy for every respondent, okay? And then I looked at the discrepancy for each individual respondent between what they say about the level of support for democracy and what I predict based on the model, okay? So if I see that there is a great consistency in the sense that what they say about how much they support democracy is consistent with what I would predict based on responses to other questions on support for democracy, okay, then I say that there is attitudinal consistency for that person, right? Now, if what they say regarding support for democracy is very different from what I would predict based on other responses to other questions on support for democracy, then I say that for that person, there is less consistency. So the measure of attitudinal consistency is basically the residual from this linear regression model that I just described, right? The difference between observed and predicted levels of support for democracy, okay? All of this is explained in detail in the paper, okay? So for example, in previous research, I saw a similar approach, but for example, where a linear regression model was estimated separately for 16, 17 versus older voters, and then they compare the R-squares, right? To try to see whether how much of the variation, for example, in support for democracy is explained by other responses to other questions on democratic values, right? If you see that the R-square is much lower for younger voters than for older voters, you would say there is less consistency, okay? But again, that only allows an aggregate comparison, and I needed a measure. That's why I used the residuals, okay? Okay, so here are the estimated models from the factor analytical model, okay? So an issue with estimating these Bayesian factor analytical models is that parameters are not identified, and unless some restriction is imposed on the parameters. What type of restrictions can be imposed? There are different decisions that analysts can make. The decision that I chose to make here to ensure identification is to fix the loading associated with one of the indicators, okay? And that's the loading associated with political interest. So if you look at this coefficient plot that I have here, okay, that shows estimates of factor loadings for the 7 indicators, for the 6 indicators, sorry. No, 7 indicators, sorry. You will see that in the case of political interest, we have a point estimate and we don't have a credible interval around it. That's because that parameter, that's not really an estimate. That's something that I fixed before estimating the model. But this is a data, but it's not as if I just made an arbitrary assumption about the loading associated with political interest. What I did is, before estimating the Bayesian factor analytical model, I did conventional confirmatory factor analysis, and I used the loading from that procedure to set the loading for this other Bayesian procedure, okay? So this estimate basically comes from conventional factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis, okay? So in terms of how do you interpret this estimate, a positive value indicates a positive relationship between the latent variable and the indicator, right? A negative estimate indicates a negative relationship between the latent variable and the indicator. And the size of the estimate gives you a sense of the strength of the relationship, okay? So in the case of political interest, this estimate comes from conventional confirmatory factor analysis. You see that it's positive, meaning that there's a positive relationship between the latent level of political maturity, okay, and political interest. And we also see positive values for the latent variable vis-a-vis political knowledge, external efficacy, internal efficacy, support for democracy, and system support. For the only variable that we see a negative estimate is for incongruence across democratic indicators, okay? And that is because when I assess attitudinal consistency and I included it in the factor analytical model, I included it as a sort of negative variable, meaning that greater incongruence means less consistency, right? So what we see here is like the more mature people are, the less incongruent they are, okay? Incongruent. So this is also as expected, right? So all the loadings have the expected, signs are consistent expectations, okay? Any questions so far? Okay, so let me show you now what I find concerning political maturity by age group. Here, what I did is for every respondent, I calculated the point estimate of political maturity, and then I looked at the distribution of point estimates among people who are 16, 17 versus 18, 19. And I looked at these distributions separately by country for Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Nicaragua. In the paper, before this plot, there's a table that summarizes overall maturity for each of the countries, right? And it's interesting here, we see, for example, significantly higher levels of maturity, for instance, in Argentina than in Nicaragua, for example, okay? So in most countries, we see a distribution that is kind of bimodal, where there's kind of an average level of maturity across the whole sample, and then we have like a relatively small group of respondents that have very low levels of maturity, and we see this across most countries and also across age groups. That's just an observation regarding overall maturity, okay? But then when we compare 16 and 17 versus 18, 19, I don't see a significant difference in any of the countries, okay? And also, remember that I said that before estimating the factor analytical model, I looked at every indicator, okay? In none of the indicators is there a difference between 16, 17, and 18, 19. Like in none of them, there's a significant difference. In none of them, there might be in one of them for one country, there might be like a tiny difference, but again, like the data totally doesn't suggest that 16, 17-year-olds are notably less mature than respondents 18, 19. Okay. So findings so far, okay? 18, 17-year-olds display levels of political maturity, not just here I wrote interest and knowledge, but in general of maturity that are comparable to those seen among 18, 19-year-olds. It doesn't, I would say that it's not as if we demonstrate forcefully, right, that 17, 18 are equally mature. I would say that more research needs to be done, but definitely we do challenge here the assumption that they are less mature. Like the evidence here doesn't suggest that they are less mature. Like we don't find evidence in that regard. So then something that I kept thinking after finding those results was that so this test that I did here is in a way a very low bar, right? It's like we're comparing 16, 17-year-olds with the next youngest group in the population, right? So I kept thinking about, well, what other comparison could I make, right? That would raise the bar a little bit. Like in terms of we are comparing 16, 17-year-olds with a group that we would expect to be more politically mature. So if we do that type of comparison, a comparison where we would expect to see a difference, do we see it, right? So then what I did is this comparison over here. So what I did is I compare all 16, 17-year-olds with people 18 and older, okay, with different levels of education. Okay, so let me see the chat because I noticed that some people wrote here. Is political maturity, so there's a question about whether is political maturity equivalent to political competence. I would say yes, depending on how you define political competence, okay? Here, I define political maturity consistently with how it was defined before, like in the existing literature, just to help with comparison between, say, my analysis and what was done before. Okay, back to this plot here. So what you're seeing here, and I apologize because I know that this plot is hard to read. I should have, for this presentation, used different colors for the different distributions. I couldn't do it for the paper, and this is the chart in the paper. I mean, I couldn't do it for the paper because in the paper I couldn't use color, right? It was only black and white. But I know that this chart is difficult to see, so let me explain it. So what we have here is, for each country separately, we have the distribution of political maturity of 16, 17-year-olds. That is the thick curve, okay? The smooth, thick curve corresponds to political maturity of 16, 17-year-olds. And then we have the distribution of political maturity among people in different age groups. Here, I didn't include here information on sample sizes, but each of these groups is pretty sizable, right? Because we are comparing, we are not looking at 16, 17 versus 18, 19 with different levels of education, but rather we're looking at 16, 17 versus everybody else with different levels of education, okay? So we have 18 plus and university education. That is the other smooth curve, okay? The thinner smooth curve. We have a density curve for people who are 18 and older and have completed high school education. That's the dashed curve. Then we have a density curve for people who are 18 plus and have finished primary education, elementary education, although they don't have they haven't completed high school education. That's the other line that has this pattern of dashes and dots, okay? And then we have a dotted line that corresponds to people who are 18 plus and have no education. I would say of the other groups, that one is the one that is like kind of smallest in size, right? Because we don't have, in some of the countries, that many people who have no education at all, okay? Although we do have, for some of the countries, a considerable number of people who report not having completed primary education. Okay, so here, so let me tell you what it's kind of the general pattern, because this is not it's not as if in every country we find this result. In the paper, in addition to this, there are tables where you have the comparison between 18, 17 and every group, differences, and the t-values associated with the differences, okay? But in general, what I find is that people who are 16, 17 years old tend to be equal or even more mature on average than people who are older and have no education at all or have not completed primary education, okay? So they tend to be more mature than those groups, or at least not less mature. And the only group that in some countries sometimes has significantly higher levels of political maturity are people who have completed a university education, who have a university degree, okay? So for example, if you look at the smooth, of the two smooth curves, if you compare the thick curve with the thinner curve, for example, in Argentina, you see that the thinner curve has a central tendency, okay, that is kind of higher than what we see for 16, 17-year-olds, meaning that people who have university, who are 18 and older and have completed university education, on average have higher levels of political maturity than people who are 16, 17. Okay, but that we find for Argentina. For other countries, we don't even find that difference. So for example, in Brazil, we see a very similar distribution of political maturity among those who are 16 and 17 as for those who are 18 and older and have completed university education, okay? And those two groups have significantly, in the case of Brazil, for example, significantly higher levels of maturity than people who are older and have lower levels of education. So in general, and this is something that I also find in like a multivariate analysis of political maturity, we do find a positive relationship between education and maturity. And because of that, in some countries, we sometimes see that although on average, there is no difference in maturity between 16, 17-year-olds and older voters, we do sometimes see that 16, 17-year-olds have lower levels of maturity than those who are older and have very high levels of education, you see? So there seems to be, so I think that in terms of overall conclusions here, so, sorry, I did have a slide with. Okay, so here, in terms of policy implications, which are what I consider the overall conclusions, it seems, based on the analysis that I did here, that extending voting rights to 16, 17-year-olds would not necessarily undermine electoral integrity in the sense that we would bring people into the electorate that are considerably less mature. Okay, definitely that's not a concern that my results support, right? But one could argue, based on some of these results, that that additional years of schooling might contribute to greater levels of political maturity among 16, 17-year-olds, okay? Why? Because we see this relationship that is positive and strong between education and political maturity, okay? So Regarding other findings, so not concerning, like just observations, I did find here, or I didn't go I didn't study in this paper the regional differences that are evident in the data. I noticed that estimates of maturity vary across countries, right? This might reflect differences in political culture, education systems, democratic stability, and so on, but it's not something that I tried to explain in this paper. Okay, so in this paper, for example, I didn't include macro level variables. Okay, so for example, we see it's very interesting, the comparison between, for example, what I noticed for Argentina versus, for example, Nicaragua and Ecuador. For example, the average levels of maturity are considerably higher in Argentina than Nicaragua, for example, in particular. And the relationship between maturity and age varies a lot across countries. So for example, in many of the different studies, there are these charts where that look at average levels of different indicators across age groups, okay? And the expectation of people who have looked at this in the past is that you would see values of these indicators that are consistently associated with greater political maturity as you move from younger age groups to older age groups. Okay, so the expectation is always that there should be some sort of either of like positive slope in these charts. When I create this type of plot for these countries, I see that type of pattern for Argentina, but in Nicaragua and Ecuador, for many of the indicators, I actually see a negative relationship, where you see for the different indicators, values that are consistent with greater maturity for the younger voters, okay? And then lower values as for among older age groups. And that's interesting, and I think that could have to do with the recent history of some of these countries, right? And kind of the political context in which some of the citizens in different age groups grew up, right? I mean, I think that really exploring this question in depth requires more data than the one that I use here, and ideally sort of long-term data, not just data from 2 years. Okay, so I'm done. I'm sorry that I went above time. Again, this was the first time that I presented this, so I feel as if I could have been more organized, but well, thank you, and I appreciate all questions and suggestions.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your research. So yeah, we got a few minutes here. If you want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature under React, or put your question in the chat.
Let me see. I think that if I stop sharing, I will see more people. Let me see the chat.
I can
Okay.
start.
Any more questions?
Yeah, so I know this is like a difficult issue for this type of project, but I'm wondering about the measurements of maturity, and specifically the system support and the support for democracy. I'm just wondering like what your reasoning is, or if that's based on any literature. Like, why is that a measure of maturity? It seems like you could be mature but also not really support the system, and also like efficacy. You know, I think maybe there's, the stereotypical like idealistic young person who thinks they're going to change the world, which is, through voting and politics, which maybe is not mature, but they do have really high efficacy. So I'm just wondering if you can talk more about why you included those measures.
Okay, so I think that this is something that I didn't discuss. I should have maybe discussed in more detail in the paper, and I didn't. I think that, I focused on how political maturity has been defined so far. So for example, if we go back to the definition that I quoted here in the presentation, one's ability and willingness to consider the effects of decisions on society at large, as well as oneself. I feel as if this definition kind of assumes that people are supportive of the democratic process, right? Like they accept being part of the system, right? And decide to participate in the system and make decisions that take into account the effects of the decisions, not just on themselves, but also society as a whole. So I feel as if support for democracy in the case of studies of political attitudes in Europe has been kind of assumed, right? I feel as if there has not been discussion of this, but I feel as if this is kind of like a basic precondition for this definition to make sense. So that's why I did, because I feel as if people are not supportive of the democratic system, right? Say if they would so prefer autocracy to democracy, then I don't think that they would be willing to consider the effects of decisions on society as well as oneself. Like, you see what I mean? That I just feel as if the way we define political maturity assumes that people have democratic values. And if they don't have democratic values, then they are not political mature in this sense, at least in the way this notion has been defined in the past. So I don't know if that makes sense to you. I didn't write this in the paper, but I feel as actually that this is something that I should engage with and discuss in a paragraph in the paper. So I'm glad that you brought it up, because I should add it. So that's what I did, because, and I feel as if in this, for example, in the 4 Latin American countries that I considered, this is a question that just cannot be overlooked, right? Because there are so many people here who have low support for democracy, okay? Who would support a coup under certain circumstances, right? You are familiar with this data, so you've seen it, right? So I just wanted to account for the reality of the region that I was working with, right?
Yeah.
And the second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part?
There wasn't really a second part. You answered that, and I think that makes sense. I think it's definitely a type of maturity. I guess it depends on how the literature talks about this. But yeah, it seems like it's kind of, if you just showed me the like factor loadings and asked me to guess what it's measuring, I would say like engagement or like I don't know, sophistication with the current political system. And I don't know if that exactly maps on to maturity in the sense of
I totally agree with you. Okay? Because, and that's why I say, as far as measurement goes, I try to be consistent with the previous literature, right? Yeah. This is what people have been looked at so far. And the issue is that how else, so if I use this data, how could I do better? For example, with the Americas Barometers data, right? I feel as if one could do better if we were designing our own question. If I was coming up with a questionnaire to like questions for evaluating political maturity, I would have made very different decisions. Like I really haven't thought about it in depth because I haven't had the chance of doing that, right? I kind of tried to do the best in terms of approximating political maturity that I could with the data at hand. And my guide were the decisions that people in the same situation as me made in the past, okay? And, but I totally agree with you that it's kind of, this might be observationally equivalent to what you would see measuring other type of concept, other related concept, right? But I find it reassuring, for example, that it loads positively with things like political interest, knowledge, efficacy, all things that are related to engagement. But also what happens with the relationship with incongruence, I think that is reassuring, right?
Yeah.
And because it's a very strong relationship, and you see it also if you just look at, say, the latent variable versus the measure of incongruence, and you plot one side by side, okay, you see that there is a negative relationship. And because this model that I used to measure incongruence included multiple indicators of democratic values, okay, and with an outcome variable that took on 7 possible values, levels, right? Support for democracy. So that's what reassures me. If I had seen, for instance, one key indicator like incongruence displaying a relationship with the latent variable that was totally inconsistent with what I would expect, then I would be worried. And I think that another thing that I would have liked to have here that I didn't, because I couldn't find enough data in the data set to do it, is include another measure of incongruence. And I did identify a few variables in the end, I didn't include them because they were missing for too many country years. That had to do, for example, with presidential approval and intention to vote for the same party again, for the party in government, right? I mean, you would expect some consistency in that, right? That if you support the president, you would be willing to re-elect the president's party, right? That would be a really good measure of incongruence to include, right? Kind of quality of the vote. You vote for something that makes sense given your evaluation of the government. But however, those data were missing, like for many of I mean, they were not, I would have been imputing that for a lot of the cases in the data and not really, say the estimate would not have been very informative.
Sure. Yeah. So we're a little bit past the hour. So maybe if people have more questions or comments, can they email you or?
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing this and for using our data. So yeah,
But
appreciate
if you have any
having-
question, comments regarding the data, please let me know. I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing here, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Definitely. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.